Hello and welcome to Mr. Pie, A Journey with Jones. I was hoping I was going to be able to introduce you to my friend Jones today, but he's still on holiday in Florida. He did send me a postcard though saying what a lovely time he's having out there, and that led me to thinking, what is time? Why is it important? Well, time's been there always. Man didn't invent time, we discovered it. We discovered time by looking at things like the sun changing throughout the day, moving over the sky. We noticed day and night, light and dark, and things like that. But time certainly is important. Look on any high street wherever you live, and you will find devices that are either recording time or telling us about time. Go and have a look yourself. For a short spell, here's what I found. Here's some examples I found around where I live. Let's have a look. Go into any jewellers and you'll see lots and lots of watches. Some from only a few pounds, right up to thousands of pounds. So clearly time today is very important. And actually, we probably rely on time more today than we ever have in our history. So what is it? What is time? Well, time is a measure. It's a measure of movement from one period to another. And man has been fascinated by how he can measure this time from almost the beginning. And it may well be that these early recollections of time were noticing things like day and night, light and dark, how some seasons got warm, some got cold, some were dry, some were wet. All of these were ways in which he noticed the passage of time as he began to notice that pattern, that hot was followed by colder times, and then at the colder times we would gradually return back to the warmer times. It went dark at night, but it would get light again the next morning. And this recognition of pattern is what started man off on recording time. And it may well be that the first way that man recorded time was just by noticing how the shadows changed during the day, how they appeared to move as the sun appeared to move across the sky. And this would have led man into developing the very early forms of sundials. And gradually these sundials would become more and more sophisticated, more and more accurate as a way of recording time. Now, as that went, it was fine, but it meant that man had no way of recording time when it was dark at night time. So they started to develop other ideas. And they started to use things like water and sand and candles burning to find ways of recording passages of time. And these early devices were exactly that, ways of recording a passage of time. They weren't clocks as such, they didn't record time the way we do today, but they would record a period of time. For example, one of the earliest devices used was a water clock or clepestra, and that was actually really a water timer, not a clock. If you had a debate going on or an argument going on, you might want to make sure that the two sides have an equal amount of time to give their argument. So what they would do is they would take a vessel, a clay pot, fill it with water, have a small hole in the bottom, and then the first person would be allowed to talk until all the water had drained from their pot. The pot would then be refilled, the bung put into the bottom, and when they were ready to talk, they would take that out, and again they would be allowed until the water had drained from the same pot. That way they would both get the same amount of time. It would take the same period of time to empty the same amount of water from the same pot. Coincidentally, that's where our phrase comes from. You're running out of time, because it was quite literally running out of the pot. But we also use things like sand timers, where the movement of sand from one vessel to another would record a period of time. And we still use those today for things like egg timers. And in schools we might use them for timing periods of 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Candles were developed with notches on, and it would take a certain amount of time for that candle to burn down 1, 2, 3, 4 notches, and so on. And all of these devices gradually allowed us to become more sophisticated about how we recorded time. Clocks as we know them today didn't really come around until about the 13th century, when they started to develop mechanical devices for recording time. And some of these early devices didn't even have hands on. They would just record a period of time, and when that passage of time had gone, a bell would sound. And then it would go on to the next one, and then again the bells would sound. And that's where the name clock comes from. It comes from the Latin clocca, which means bell. So a clock is actually originally a sounding device, recording time with sound. And if you go to any village today, you'll find clocks on churches, and many of those have bells that sound when it gets to the hour or the half hour. And you might wonder, well, what is that bell all about? Well, originally, as I said, clock comes from bell. But in the days long before we all had our own watches on our wrists and such like, people working in the fields would only be able to tell the time from the clock in the village. Well, clearly, if you're working out in the field, you can't see the clock, it's too far away. But you would have been able to hear the bell sounding, so you would have been able to tell what the time was by listening for the bell. Now, this original clocks then with bells on were also then developed with a single hand that would record the hours, and they would have a hand on much like the one we have today, which we call the hour hand, and it would simply go round slowly during the day, pointing at the different hours. And you might think, well, that's not very good, you can't tell the time very accurately. But you can tell the time as accurately as they needed to. In those days they didn't need to know exactly how many minutes had gone free between hours. They just needed to know what the time was approximately. So it was approximately 9 o'clock, or it was halfway between 9 and 10, so it was 9:30, or gradually it was getting close to 10, and so on. And this was accurate enough for people around that time. Around the 16th century, they started to develop clocks using springs, which meant they could do away with the heavy weights that they'd been using previously. And around that same time, they added another hand to the clock, which would go round 12 times faster than the hour hand, and would therefore be able to tell us accurately what minutes had passed as well as what hours. And hence we would have a clock that looks a lot more like we have today. Now, these clocks would be often sighted in main areas, like on a church, or on a tower in the middle of a town or a market square. Very few people would be able to afford to have a clock of their own at home. They were incredibly expensive devices because everything had to be made by hand, and it would take months for a clockmaker to build one clock. So often in a village or a town, people would tell the time just by looking at their one clock that was closest to them, or listening for the bells to sound when it got to the hour or the half-past hour. But as time developed, clocks became more and more commonplace, and people began to own more and more clocks. But what didn't change was that people would rely on the one clock in the town or the village to be the one that told them what the main time was, and they might then set their own clock by that one. But what they wouldn't have necessarily appreciated was that in another village the time might be slightly different. So if you were in one village, your clock in that village might be showing 11 o'clock, whereas the next village 5 miles up the road, it might be 10 minutes past 11 o'clock. Well, that didn't matter originally in those days, because there was no quick transport, there was no means of telephoning anyone, so nobody would necessarily be aware that the time was different in each town or village. That is, until the railways were invented. And then, because of the advent of the railway, it became apparent that time was different in different towns. And this didn't work with the railways, because how can you possibly set a timetable if you have different times in every town? So we standardised time, and we developed what's now known as Greenwich Mean Time. And this would be a time that would operate in all towns and villages across the entire country. Eventually this would then develop further, and we would develop time zones around the world, so that the time in London might be 12 o'clock midday, and the time in New York would be 7 o'clock in the morning on that same day, some 5 hours later. This is because of the fact that the Earth rotates and the sun shines on different parts of the world at different times in the day, so therefore we end up with time zones. You might want to go and learn a little bit more about time zones, and if you go on to Google and have a look at things like time zone clocks, you'll get lots of information which tells you what the different time is in different parts of the world. Now, this idea of standardised time was an essential aspect of the railway industry, an essential means of them timetabling their trains, because not only did they need to be able to tell people what time their train would be arriving and departing from the various stations along its journey, but people would want to be able to identify that they could get one train and then connect with another one. So if their journey involved 1, 2 or 3 different trains, they could organise their journey to make sure that each train coincided with the others. So let's have a look at a clock and see how it works. Well, as you can see, the majority of clocks today will have at least 2 hands on them. They will have a shorter hand which goes round and tells us the time in hours, and that will take one rotation every 12 hours. So it takes 12 hours for that hand to go round once. Now the minute hand, on the other hand, that goes round 12 times faster. That will go round one rotation in 1 hour. So in the same period that the hour hand has gone round once, the minute hand will have gone round 12 times. Now you may also have a third hand on your clock, and that would tell you the time in seconds, and that will go around 60 times as fast as the minute hand. So you'll find that that is going round one full rotation every minute, or 60 rotations for every one full rotation of the minute hand. So let's have a look at how we tell the time. Well, to start with, let's forget the minute hand for the moment and just concentrate on the hour hand. If we look at a hand on the clock and we see it is part way between 2 numbers, we can say that it is halfway between. So it is half past the lower value number, or the number it has already gone past, the number behind it. And we're actually already beginning to tell the time just by looking at that one hand. Now, if we want to be more accurate, we then look at the minute hand and see where that is. Now, the minute hand uses the same markers on the clock as the hour hand, and because the minute hand goes round 12 times faster, it goes round one full rotation in an hour, and there are 12 markers on there, but that's 60 minutes. So each marker, each 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, represents a 5-minute period. So the number 1 on the clock is 5 minutes of time have gone. The number 2 is 10 minutes. The number 3 is 15 minutes, and so on. And we can count the minutes around there using those periods. Now, over time we've developed a particular language for telling the time in minutes, and we say that those numbers between 1 and 5 we class as minutes after or minutes past the hour. So if the hand has gone past the 2, all of the minutes that we would see with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, they will be past the hour time. Conversely, the numbers 7 up to 11 will record the minutes to the next hour, so the hour that we're moving towards. So again, if our hand has gone past the 2, then we are now recording the time of minutes until it's 3 o'clock. So if we look, we find that if the large hand is pointing at the 10, then that is 10 minutes before the next hour. Now, the number 10 is completely irrelevant to this. It's just pure coincidence that it's a 10. The reason it's 10 minutes before is because it is 2 intervals before the o'clock, the number 12. One interval takes us to 11 and another interval takes us to 10. 2 times 5 is 10. The number 10 being there is purely coincidental. And then if we go to 8, that's 4 intervals before, so 4 times 5 is 20 minutes too. And the number 7 is 5 intervals before. 5 times 5 is 25 minutes too. Now the only other ones that we need to think about are the 3, the 6 and the 9. The 3 is a quarter of the rotation of the minute hand in the full hour, so we call that quarter past. The 6 is exactly halfway round, so we say that is half past. And then the number 9 has got a quarter of a rotation left to do until it's done the full hour, so we call that a quarter to the next hour. Have a look at the clocks that I've created here and see if these help you. Now you might ask yourself, well, how can I learn to tell the time? And quite simply, it's just a matter of practice. There is no magical way. You can't go to bed and listen to something and wake up the next morning and you now know how to tell the time. It is just simply practicing. The more you practice, the more you learn and the quicker you get to understand it. So, why not do something over the next week or maybe even a month that will help you practice telling the time? Why not do a little chart and maybe work with an adult and think about things that you do regularly throughout the day? Maybe what time you get up each morning, what time you have breakfast, what time you go out to school, what time you get home from school, what time you have your evening meal, and what time you go to bed at night. Things like that. And you could do the same with an adult. What time do they get up? What time do they get to work? And ask them to keep a similar diary to you and compare the two. Do you get up at the same time every morning? Do you and the adult that you're working with do things at the same time? Are there things you do together? And so therefore at the same time. Do you have your tea or your evening meal at the same time every day? And so on. Learn to just do that. Keep a diary of times. This will help you to give you practice of learning to tell the time. Alternatively, another idea might be to see if an adult has got an old watch they can let you have, so you can learn to tell the time throughout the day and see how long it takes for 5 minutes to pass. How quick is that? Does it always seem quick? Are there some times when it feels longer than other times? Why might that be? Here's a challenge for you as well. Maybe look at the EPG, the electronic program guide on your TV for Sky or whatever, Freeview, etc. Do the programs all start at the same times? Is that true across all channels? Why might there be certain programs that don't start at a set time, like start at just after 9 o'clock, or maybe just before 8 o'clock? What things that come on at the same time every day? Are there programs that are always on at 6 o'clock? Are there programs that always come on at 9 o'clock? Do certain programs finish at the same time every day? And while we're looking at that, maybe compare programs on the BBC with programs on other channels. Is there the same amount of time between a program finishing on BBC and the next one starting? Or is there a longer period for ITV? Why might that be? Why might there be slight differences between things like ITV and Sky and BBC, etc.? Maybe you could decide that you want to create your own TV channel. What time will they start on your channel? What time will they finish? Get a TV guide or something like that. They're quite cheap in the newsagents, and start to put a channel together of your own. What would you have on at 9 o'clock in the morning? Particularly if it was a school holiday. What would you have on as a typical day during a school holiday? How would your programs be organised? Have a think about things like that. Remember, it's all about time. And the more time you take experiencing time, the better you will understand it. So, until next time, have fun looking around the house. Look for devices in the house. How many of them have got a clock in them? How much importance is time in your house? And maybe keep one of those diaries or a TV program guide of your own. Until then, see you. Bye bye.